March 8, 1944, 0430 hours. The Chindwin River, Burma, India border. Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi stood on the eastern bank of the Chindwin, watching 15,000 men wade into the darkness. The river, swollen by early monsoon rains, rose to their chests. Above them, no moon. Behind them, the Burmese jungle, a wall of green-black silence. Ahead, across 70 miles of mountain and forest, lay the British stronghold of Imphal. Mutaguchi felt invincible. His soldiers carried only 20 days of rations. Their orders were simple: cross the mountains, destroy the British supply depots, seize Imphal within 3 weeks. After that, they would live off the land, foraging from captured enemy stores, requisitioning from Indian villages, hunting in the jungle. Ammunition? Each man carried 120 rounds. Artillery? 300 rounds per gun. The Japanese doctrine of seishin, fighting spirit, would compensate for everything else. The general had led soldiers across China. He had conquered Malaya in 70 days, Singapore in 8. British soldiers, he believed, lacked the Japanese warriors' steel. They were soft, dependent on their supply lines. Cut those lifelines, and they would collapse like puppets with severed strings. What Mutaguchi didn't know, what his staff officers had tried desperately to tell him, was that he had already lost this campaign. Not to British bullets, but to something invisible, something his samurai training couldn't defeat, something waiting in the forests ahead with patient, microscopic hunger. Plasmodium falciparum, Shigella dysenterii, Rickettsia provozekii. The scientific names meant nothing to Mutaguchi. Malaria, dysentery, typhus. He had dismissed these concerns during planning meetings. Sickness is a failure of will, he had declared. Japanese soldiers do not surrender to disease. He was wrong. Behind him, stacked in wooden crates near the riverbank, sat the division's medical supplies. Quinine tablets for malaria, rehydration salts for dysentery, antiseptic for wounds, enough for perhaps 10 days of moderate casualties. The medical officers had requested 5 times this amount. Mutaguchi had refused. Weight, he argued, was better spent on ammunition. A soldier could fight through illness. He couldn't fight without bullets. The mathematics of this decision would prove catastrophic. As the first soldiers reached the far shore, Mutaguchi turned to his operations officer, Colonel Iwaichi Fujiwara. How many men crossed tonight? 15,000 infantry, General. The 33rd Division Vanguard. Behind them 2 more divisions. Another 35,000 men. 50,000 total for Operation Yugo. 50,000. The number satisfied Mutaguchi. Against the British garrison at Imphal, perhaps 15,000 Commonwealth troops, the odds were overwhelming. Japanese soldiers were worth 3 British soldiers. Everyone knew this. The mathematics were simple. But there were other calculations. Calculations that Mutaguchi's staff had prepared, then buried when the general refused to listen. Hidden in a supply tent, locked in a metal case, sat a report from Lieutenant Colonel Tanaka, the 15th Army's chief medical officer, dated February 3, 1944. Marked, Ura, Urgent, Operational Concern. Mutaguchi had read the first page, then ordered it filed. Not destroyed, he was no fool, but rendered invisible through bureaucratic burial. The report's key findings: malarial infection rate in Burmese jungle operations, 92% of troops within 8 weeks. Cerebral malaria mortality without treatment, 1520%. Dysentery infection rate, 78% within 6 weeks. Mortality rate without rehydration, 812%. Beriberi, thiamine deficiency incidents on rice-only diet, 45% within 10 weeks. Typhus mortality in malnourished populations, 1030%. The document concluded with a stark warning. Without continuous aerial resupply of medical materials and foodstuffs, casualty rates from disease will exceed combat casualties by a factor of 10 to 1. Recommend postponement until air superiority and supply infrastructure are established. Mutaguchi had written in the margin, cowardice disguised as caution, rejected. Now, watching his soldiers disappear into the jungle darkness, the general allowed himself a moment of reflection. This offensive would change the war. British India would fall. Churchill's empire would crack. Tokyo would celebrate Mutaguchi as the greatest commander since Admiral Togo. The first cases of malaria appeared 62 hours later. By March 15th, 7 days into the operation, field hospitals reported 300 severe cases. The number doubled every 4 days. Soldiers began collapsing on jungle trails, their bodies racked with fevers exceeding 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Some experienced cerebral malaria, parasites invading the brain causing seizures, coma, death. Medical corpsmen, overwhelmed, could do nothing. The quinine supply, already depleted, would be exhausted by March 20th. But Mutaguchi, 30 miles behind the front lines, still received optimistic reports. His intelligence officers filtered the casualty numbers. Minor illness, they wrote. Troops remain combative. The generals studied his maps, calculated distances to infall, and smiled. He had no idea that his army was already dying, not fighting, dying. This is the story of how 140,000 Japanese soldiers were killed by a supply chain failure, how disease mathematics overwhelmed warrior spirit, and how the worst military disaster in Japanese history unfolded not on a battlefield, but in the silent, microscopic war between human ambition and biological reality. Operation Yugo was born from strategic desperation wrapped in tactical arrogance. By early 1944, Japan's position in Burma had deteriorated. Allied forces, now including American-trained Chinese divisions and British Indian Commonwealth troops, were pushing southward. The American general Joseph Stilwell was constructing a road through northern Burma to supply nationalist China. British forces, under General William Slim, were reorganizing after earlier defeats, building a formidable supply infrastructure based on aerial resupply. Mutaguchi's plan aimed to preempt this Allied offensive, seize Imphal and Kohima, the two British strongholds in northeastern India, and the entire Allied position would collapse, cut the supply routes, isolate the enemy forces, and inflict such catastrophic losses that Churchill would negotiate peace in Asia. Perhaps India itself would rise in rebellion against British rule, seeing Japanese liberators marching through Delhi. Beautiful theory. Suicidal practice. The distance from the Chindwin River to Imphal, 70 miles as the crow flies, but 130 miles of actual marching through terrain that defied military logistics. The route crossed 3 mountain ranges, each exceeding 7,000 feet. Trails barely wide enough for pack mules, no roads suitable for trucks. The jungle was so dense that visibility dropped to 50 feet. Rivers with no bridges, swelling unpredictably with rain. Japanese logistics doctrine called this advance by infiltration. Instead of building supply roads, troops would carry what they needed, moving fast to seize enemy supplies before their own ran out. The system had worked in Malaya and Singapore, where distances were shorter and captured British depots were abundant. Burma was different. The British had learned from earlier defeats. General Slim, commanding the 14th Army, had studied Japanese tactics obsessively. He knew Mutaguchi's army would outrun its supply lines. So Slim did something revolutionary. He abandoned traditional supply methods entirely. Instead of supply columns vulnerable to ambush, Slim built an aerial supply network. Transport aircraft, American C-47 Dakotas primarily, would deliver everything: ammunition, food, medical supplies, even artillery pieces. Forward airstrips, protected by strongpoints, would receive these supplies. British and Indian troops would never outrun their logistics because the mathematics were stunning. A single C-47 could carry 3 tons of supplies and make 2 trips daily. 50 aircraft could deliver 300 tons per day, enough to sustain 15,000 soldiers indefinitely. The British deployed 120 Dakotas to the Burma theater by March 1944, plus 60 RAF transport gliders for heavy equipment. Japanese aerial supply capacity? Effectively zero. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force had been decimated in the Southwest Pacific. Remaining aircraft were needed for homeland defense. Mutaguchi's 15th Army would receive no aerial resupply. Not because Tokyo refused, because the capability simply didn't exist. This meant everything would be carried on the backs of men and animals. A Japanese infantry division in 1944 required approximately 200 tons of supplies daily during active combat operations. Food, ammunition, medical materials, over 30 days, that's 6,000 tons per division. Mutaguchi commanded 3 divisions, 18,000 tons of supplies for a 1-month campaign. How would this be transported? The 15th Army assembled 15,000 horses, water buffalo, and oxen for the operation. Each animal could carry approximately 200 pounds over mountain terrain. Simple arithmetic. 15,000 animals carrying 200 pounds each equals 3,000 tons, enough for 5 days of 3-division operations. Then the animals would need to be fed. Forage in the jungle? Minimal. Bamboo doesn't nourish horses. The animals themselves would starve within 2 weeks unless supplied with fodder. But carrying fodder meant less space for combat supplies. The logistics staff calculated that sustaining operations beyond 20 days was mathematically impossible without captured British supplies or established forward depots. They presented these calculations to Mutaguchi. He dismissed them. Capture moves faster than calculation, he declared. His operations officer, Colonel Fujiwara, tried a different approach.
General, even if we reach Imphal, how will we evacuate the wounded? The question hung in the air. Traditional military medicine required evacuating casualties to rear area hospitals.
Surgical teams, blood supplies, recovery wards. The Japanese medical infrastructure in Burma consisted of 2 field hospitals, each with 50 beds, located 90 miles behind the front lines. Reaching them required 4 days of travel through the jungle. Impossible for a soldier with a penetrating abdominal wound or shattered femur. Mutaguchi's solution: light casualties will fight through pain. Serious casualties will die honorably. This wasn't rhetoric. It was operational policy. Wounded soldiers unable to retreat would be given grenades and told to contribute one final time by detonating themselves in the presence of enemy soldiers. Medical corpsmen received these orders in writing. But bullets and shrapnel would prove almost irrelevant compared to the microscopic enemies waiting in Burma's jungles. Malaria, caused by Plasmodium parasites transmitted by Anopheles mosquitoes. Burma's tropical environment was a perfect habitat. Mosquitoes are bred in stagnant water, puddles, and rice paddies. A single mosquito bite could introduce thousands of parasites into the bloodstream. Within the body, parasites invaded red blood cells, multiplied, burst the cells, invaded more. The cycle produced rhythmic fevers every 48 hours for Plasmodium falciparum, the deadliest species. Untreated malaria killed 15% of victims through cerebral complications, kidney failure, or severe anemia. Treatment required quinine or the newer synthetic drug atabrine, taken daily as a prophylactic, then in larger doses when symptoms appeared. The Japanese supply plan allocated 30 days of malarial prophylaxis per soldier. After that, nothing. Dysentery. Bacterial or amoebic infection of the intestines spread through contaminated water. Symptoms began with cramping, then progressed to bloody diarrhea, dehydration, shock. In severe cases, victims lost 10% of body weight in 72 hours. Treatment required clean water, rehydration salts, antibiotics, rare in 1944, and rest. Japanese soldiers would drink from streams, rivers, puddles. Water purification tablets existed, but the supply was tiny. Soldiers were instructed to boil water before drinking, but this required stopping, gathering wood, lighting fires, time-consuming, and tactically dangerous. Most drank unboiled water. Medical projections predicted 78% dysentery infection rates within 6 weeks. Mutaguchi called this pessimistic rumor-mongering. Beriberi, vitamin B1 thiamine deficiency caused by eating only polished white rice. Symptoms progressed from fatigue to leg swelling to cardiac failure and paralysis. Prevention required dietary diversity, vegetables, meat, or thiamine supplements. Japanese field rations consisted of rice, and more rice, occasionally dried fish. No vitamin supplements. Within 8 weeks, soldiers would begin showing beriberi symptoms. Typhus, bacterial infections spread by body lice, thriving in unwashed uniforms and crowded conditions. Fever, rash, delirium, death in up to 30% of cases. Prevention required hygiene, laundering uniforms, delousing powder, sanitation. Japanese soldiers would wear the same uniforms for weeks. No replacements, no laundry, no delousing powder in the supply chain. Body lice would multiply exponentially in the humid jungle environment. General Slim understood disease mathematics perfectly. His medical staff projected casualty rates and planned accordingly. Each British Indian division deployed with its own field hospital, 200 beds, surgical teams, blood bank, pharmacy. Behind the front, larger base hospitals provided 600 additional beds per division. Further back, in India proper, convalescent facilities could house thousands. Malarial prophylaxis was mandatory. Every soldier received daily atabrine tablets, which turned skin slightly yellow but prevented most infections. Water purification was rigorous. Every canteen included purification tablets, Field kitchens boiled all cooking water. Latrines were dug according to strict sanitation protocols. Diet was diversified. British and Indian rations included canned meat, vegetables, tea, sugar, biscuits. Vitamin supplements were distributed weekly. Even in forward positions, aerial supply maintained dietary standards. The resource commitment was staggering. Roughly 30% of aerial supply tonnage consisted of medical and hygiene materials, a ratio Japanese planners would have considered insane. But the mathematics worked. British casualty rates from disease in the Burma campaign approximately 12%. Japanese casualty rates would exceed 90%. This wasn't a battle between two armies. It was a collision between two philosophies. One that treated logistics as warfare's foundation, and one that treated logistics as cowardice. Mutaguchi's soldiers began marching into the jungle, each man carrying 20 days of rice, 120 rounds of ammunition, and absolute faith in their commander's genius. The jungle waited. March 15, 1944. Day 7 of Operation Yugo. Captain Jiro Tanaka, commanding a rifle company in the 33rd Division, watches his lead scout collapse face first on the trail. Not shot. Not wounded by mine or booby trap. The man simply crumples, as though strings have been cut. Tanaka rushed. The scout's skin burns with fever. His eyes roll back, show convulsions rack his body. Rhythmic, violent. Cerebral malaria. The parasites have invaded his brain. The company medic kneels, checks the man's pulse, then looks at Tanaka with hollow eyes. He needs quinine. Intravenous. Immediately. How much do we have? I used the last vial yesterday, Captain. On Lieutenant Sato. Tanaka feels something crack inside his chest. Not fear. Not yet. Just the first hairline fracture in his certainty. When does resupply arrive? The medic doesn't answer. They both know. There is no resupply. The scout dies 4 hours later, still convulsing. By March 20th, Tanaka's company, originally 180 men, reported 43 soldiers too sick to march. Most have malaria. Others suffer from dysentery, evident from the bloody trails they leave at every rest stop. The stench is unbearable. Tanaka receives orders from the battalion, leave the sick behind, continue advancing. The battalion will establish a trail hospital. Trail hospital means a clearing with no medical supplies, no doctors, and no evacuation plan. It's where soldiers go to die slowly. Tanaka obeys orders. What else can he do? March 29, 1944, Day 21. The 33rd Division reaches the outskirts of Imphal. Against all odds, despite horrific casualties, advanced elements penetrate to within artillery range of British positions. Mutaguchi, receiving the news at headquarters, believes victory is imminent. He's looking at the wrong numbers. The division began with 15,000 combat effectives. Field reports claim 12,000 still operational. But these numbers are lies, carefully constructed bureaucratic fictions designed to avoid the general's wrath. The reality, documented in a medical officer's private diary, later recovered from his corpse. March 29th, conducted audit of 3rd Battalion, 214th Regiment. Nominal strength, 850 men. Actual count, 611 present. Of these, 389 suffering active illness, mostly malaria and dysentery. Perhaps 200 men capable of combat operations. 56 soldiers died in the past week. Only 9 were killed by enemy fire. 47 dead from disease. Cannot report accurate numbers to division. Ordered to maintain nominal strength figures to preserve morale. The mathematics are staggering. If 3rd Battalion's casualty rate is representative, and diary evidence suggests it is, then the 33rd Division has perhaps 4,000 combat-effective soldiers remaining, not 12,000. The division is now the size of a reinforced regiment. Fighting strength has decreased 73% in 3 weeks, and the survivors are starving. The 20-day ration supply expired 9 days ago. Foraging has produced virtually nothing. The Burmese jungle contains no wild game large enough to feed an army, no fruit trees in sufficient quantity, no villages to requisition from. Soldiers eat leaves, bark, roots. Some kill pack animals despite orders, devouring the meat raw to avoid cooking fires that might reveal their positions. Beriberi cases are multiplying. Soldiers report numb legs, difficulty breathing, heart palpitations. Some can no longer march, their legs paralyzed by neurological damage. Meanwhile, British positions grow stronger. General Slim's aerial supply network operates like clockwork. C-47 transports land every 20 minutes at Imphal's airfield, delivering ammunition, food, medical supplies, and reinforcements. In a single day, March 28th, 143 flights deliver 430 tons of material. Japanese soldiers, watching from concealed positions, see this aerial armada with growing despair. They have nothing comparable, not even close. April 12, 1944. Day 35. Mutaguchi orders a general assault on Imphal. 3 divisions, 33rd, 15th, and 31st, are to attack simultaneously, overwhelming British defences through sheer numbers and fighting spirit. The attack fails before it begins. The 33rd Division, tasked with the main assault, musters fewer than 3,000 soldiers capable of attacking. Most are weakened by weeks of malnutrition and recurring malarial fevers. They advance against prepared British positions and are shattered by artillery and machine gun fire. Casualties: 800 killed or wounded in 6 hours. Ground gained: 0. But the real disaster isn't the failed attack, it's what's happening behind the lines. Soldiers too weak to fight are simply left. Some lie beside trails, hoping comrades will carry them to aid stations. Most die waiting. Others, delirious with fever, wander off paths and disappear into the vegetation. The jungle swallows them. A new horror emerges: the sound of single gunshots in the forest. Officers are distributing grenades to seriously wounded soldiers, along with quiet instructions. Some wounded men comply, others refuse, clinging to life despite. Arguments erupt. In at least one documented case, a sergeant executes a wounded soldier who refuses to commit suicide, then files a report claiming the man died of illness. The operation has become something worse than military defeat. It's a mass death by administrative decision. May 3rd, 1944. Day 57. The monsoon rains begin. Within hours, trails become rivers of mud. Soldiers sink to their knees with every step. Uniforms, already rotting from weeks of wear, dissolve in the constant deluge. Skin, never dry, develops jungle rot. Fungal infections that eat through flesh. Dysentery, already an epidemic, becomes universal. Contaminated water is everywhere. Soldiers drink from puddles, streams swollen with runoff, pools filled with decaying vegetation. Within 72 hours of drinking, the cramping begins. Then bloody diarrhea, then dehydration, then shock, then death. Medical corpsmen have nothing to offer. No rehydration salts, no antibiotics, no clean water. They watch soldiers die, unable to provide. Typhus explodes through the ranks, body lice, thriving in the humid conditions and unwashed uniforms, spread rickettsia bacteria rapidly. Soldiers develop high fevers. In 30% of cases, the infection kills within 2 weeks. Survivors are left permanently weakened. The 15th Division, attacking Kohima to the north, reaches its objective but lacks the strength to hold it. The division's combat strength, originally 15,000, has declined to fewer than 2,000 effective soldiers. They retreat, leaving behind 3,000 sick and wounded men who cannot be evacuated. These men die over the following weeks, some from wounds, most from starvation and disease. May 31st, 1944. Day 84. Mutaguchi, at headquarters 90 miles behind the disintegrating front lines, receives casualty reports. The numbers are devastating, but he refuses to accept them. These figures represent temporary illness, he insists during a staff meeting. Fighting spirit will overcome physical weakness. The offensive continues. His staff officers stare at him. Some have visited forward positions. They've seen the roads of bones, trails lined with corpses, some skeletal from starvation, others bloated from disease. They've seen soldiers too weak to stand, lying in their own filth, waiting for death. Colonel Fujiwara, the operations officer, attempts intervention. "General, we must withdraw. The army is dying." Mutaguchi slams his fist on the table. "Retreat is unthinkable. We advance until Imphal falls, or the last man dies." Fujiwara realizes his commander has descended into madness. The general lives in a fantasy where willpower can defeat biology, where spirit can overcome starvation, where Japanese soldiers are supernatural beings, but reality cares nothing for fantasies. On June 3rd, Imperial headquarters in Tokyo ordered the offensive terminated. Mutaguchi is instructed to withdraw his forces to the Chindwin River and establish defensive positions. The retreat becomes a death march. Soldiers, many too weak to carry weapons, stumble westward through jungle and monsoon rain. They leave behind everything except the will to survive. Artillery pieces are abandoned, trucks, long since out of fuel, rust beside trails. Documents burn in sudden bonfires as units destroy evidence. So many corpses that the route is nicknamed the Road of Bones, a phrase that will haunt Japanese military history. Soldiers who collapse are left behind. No one has the strength to carry them. Some are given grenades. Others are simply abandoned, left to die slowly of dehydration, starvation, or disease. By early July, the survivors reached the Chindwin River, the starting point for March. Of 53,000 Japanese soldiers who began Operation Yugo, fewer than 12,000 survive. The mathematics of destruction are precise and pitiless. When Japanese medical officers compiled casualty reports after Operation Yugo, the numbers revealed a truth more devastating than any battlefield defeat. Total Japanese casualties, approximately 53,000 soldiers. Killed in combat by enemy action, 6,950. Died from disease, starvation, and medical neglect, 46,050. The ratio was almost 7-1. For every soldier killed by British bullets, 7 died from preventable, but it was institutional suicide. Break down the disease casualties further, and the horror deepens. Malaria, all forms, 18,200 deaths. Dysentery, bacterial and amoebic, 12,400 deaths. Starvation and beriberi, 8,900 deaths. Typhus, 4,100 deaths. Other infections and jungle diseases, 2,450 deaths. Each number represents a human being who died slowly, in agony, because his commanders valued ammunition over medicine, fighting spirit over logistics, tactical aggression over supply infrastructure. Compare this to British casualties in the same campaign. Total British and Commonwealth casualties, Imphal Kohima battles, 17,587. Killed in combat, 4,064. Died from disease, 1,206. Evacuated for medical treatment, survived, 12,317. The British lost fewer total casualties than the Japanese lost to disease alone. And most British casualties survived, evacuated to hospitals where they received treatment, recovered, and many eventually returned to duty. The mathematics reveal two armies living in different centuries. Mutaguchi's defeat wasn't decided in the jungles of Burma. It was decided in the shipyards of California, the aircraft factories of Kansas, the medical supply plants of New Jersey, all operating at full capacity in 94344. Consider the C-47 Dakota transport aircraft, the workhorse of Allied aerial supply. The Douglas Aircraft Company produced the C-47 at 3 factories: Santa Monica, California, Long Beach, California, and Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Peak production, 130 aircraft per month during 1943. Total wartime production, 10,048 aircraft. Each C-47 cost $138,000 to manufacture, roughly $2 million in 2024 currency. The Allies could afford to lose these aircraft, and did. Hundreds were destroyed because the factories simply built more. Production was continuous, redundant, and seemingly infinite. Japan had no equivalent capability. The Japanese aviation industry produced the Mitsubishi Ki-57 transport, comparable to the C-47 but slower and less reliable. Total wartime production, 507 aircraft. Peak monthly production, 19 aircraft. The disparity was 25-1. For every Japanese transport aircraft, the Allies built 25. This gap extended across every logistical category. American pharmaceutical companies produced antibiotics, sulfur drugs, penicillin after 1943, antimalarials, atabrine, vitamins and rehydration compounds on an industrial scale, a single facility. Merck & Company's Rahway, New Jersey plant produced more anti-malarial tablets in 1944 than the entire Japanese pharmaceutical industry combined. Why? Because American planners understood that healthy soldiers are productive soldiers. Every dollar spent on medicine saved $10 in replacement training costs. Every soldier evacuated and cured returned to duty. Medical investment was military investment. Japanese military doctrine viewed medicine differently. Sickness was a weakness. Weakness was shameful. Resources spent keeping weak soldiers alive were wasted resources. Better to spend those resources on bullets and train new soldiers to replace the dead. This philosophy was economically insane. Training a replacement infantry soldier required 4 months and cost approximately 12,000 yen, roughly $30,000 in 2024 dollars. Treating that same soldier's malaria required 150 yen worth of quinine. The mathematics were obvious. Spend 150 yen on medicine or 12,000 yen on replacement. Japan chose a replacement. Multiply this decision across 50,000 soldiers and you see Operation Yugo's real price tag. American field rations in 1944 included the C ration: canned meals with meat, vegetables, biscuits, candy, cigarettes, and toilet paper. Total caloric value, 3,000 calories per day. Weight per day, 2.2 pounds. Nutritionally balanced to prevent deficiency diseases. Japanese field rations consisted primarily of rice. Total caloric value, 1,800. 200 calories per day. Weight per day, 1.8 pounds. Nutritionally deficient in virtually every vitamin and mineral. The American ration cost $1.50 per day to produce. The Japanese ration cost 35 cents per day. On paper, Japan was more efficient. In reality, Japanese soldiers developed beriberi, scurvy, and pellagra, deficiency diseases that crippled combat effectiveness. The savings on rations cost more in lost productivity than would have been spent on better food. But the deepest difference wasn't industrial capacity. It was philosophical. General Slim understood warfare as a system. Victory required integrating combat operations, logistics, medicine, intelligence, and morale into a coherent whole. Soldiers were assets requiring maintenance. Supply chains were combat multipliers. Hospitals were force regeneration centers. Slim's logistics consumed roughly 60% of his army's efforts. Only 40% was combat in the traditional sense: shooting, maneuvering, attacking. The tail was longer than the tooth, and Slim was proud of this ratio. It meant his soldiers fought with full bellies, adequate ammunition, and medical support. Mutaguchi viewed logistics as an obstacle to overcome through warrior spirit. Supply chains were crutches for weak soldiers. Real warriors advanced regardless of logistics, lived off captured supplies, accepted death as honorable. The ideal ratio was reversed: 90% combat effort, 10% logistics. This philosophy had historical roots. Japanese military culture descended from samurai traditions emphasizing personal courage, contempt for death, and spiritual purity through suffering. The Bushido Code valorized self-sacrifice. Logistics planning was seen as an unseemly calculation, diminishing the purity of warrior spirit. These values produced extraordinary individual soldiers, men who fought ferociously, accepted horrific conditions uncomplainingly, and died with dignity. But these same values produce strategic catastrophe. Because modern warfare is not a samurai duel, it's an industrial competition. It's mathematics. It's the side that can bring more calories, more bullets, more medicine, more replacement soldiers to the battlefield, sustainably, continuously, indefinitely. Japan couldn't compete on these terms, so Japanese commanders pretended those terms didn't matter. Spirit would overcome material deficiency. Will would defeat mathematics. 53,000 corpses in the Burmese jungle proved otherwise. Disease casualties created a cascade of failures that multiplied beyond the initial biological damage. A soldier with malaria becomes combat ineffective before he dies. His comrades must carry him, diverting labor from combat tasks. When he's left behind, morale collapses among the survivors, who realize they'll receive the same abandonment if they sicken. A soldier with dysentery requires constant water and frequent stops. His unit moves slower. The unit arrives at objectives late, missing coordinated attacks. Other units, attacking on schedule, find themselves unsupported and are destroyed. A soldier with beriberi can barely walk. He cannot carry ammunition forward or wounded men rearward. He consumes food without providing labor. He becomes a net drag on unit effectiveness. Multiply these individual degradations across 50,000 soldiers, and entire divisions evaporate. By week 8 of Operation Yugo, the 33rd Division existed on paper but not in reality. It had a commander, staff, and organizational structure, but it had no combat power. The division couldn't defend the ground it occupied, much less attack. It was a ghost, a bureaucratic fiction maintained through falsified reports. The British faced an enemy already defeated before the first major battle. This is the ultimate logistics truth. You cannot fight effectively if your soldiers are dying of preventable diseases. No amount of courage compensates for cerebral malaria. No warrior spirit overcomes intestinal parasites. Biology sets hard limits on human performance, and those limits are non-negotiable. Japan's commanders learned this truth through the deaths of 140,000 soldiers across the entire Burma campaign. Mutaguchi's Operation Yugo was merely the most concentrated example. The lesson echoes through military history. Logistics isn't everything in war, but without logistics, everything else is nothing. Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi survived the campaign. He retreated across the Chinwin River in July 1944, watching the remnants of his army stagger behind him, skeletal figures more dead than alive, uniforms rotted to rags, equipment abandoned. He felt no responsibility. The failure, he insisted, was his subordinates' lack of fighting spirit. Imperial headquarters disagreed. Mutaguchi was relieved of command on July 10, 1944, and recalled to Tokyo. He was never given another operational command. After Japan's surrender in 1945, he lived in obscurity, writing self-justifying memoirs that blamed everyone except himself. He died in 1966, age 78, still insisting Operation Yugo would have succeeded if his division commanders had shown proper Japanese spirit. His soldiers were less fortunate. Of the 53,000 Japanese soldiers who participated in Operation Yugo, approximately 12,000 survived to reach the Chindwin River in July. Of these survivors, an estimated 4,000 died in the following months from lingering illness, malnutrition effects, and infection. Perhaps 8,000 soldiers eventually recovered enough to return to duty. The survival rate was 15%. This means 85% of Mutaguchi's army died or became permanently disabled. For comparison, German casualty rates on the Eastern Front, the most brutal theater of World War II, averaged 40% over 6 years. Mutaguchi achieved double that rate in 4 months. The individual stories are almost unbearable. Captain Jiro Tanaka, whose company we followed earlier, was found in August 1944 by a British patrol, delirious with malaria and weighing 82 pounds. Evacuated to a POW hospital, he eventually recovered and survived the war. In his 1978 memoir, The Road We Could Not Return From, he wrote, "I watched 90% of my men die, and I could do nothing. Not nothing because I was cowardly. Nothing because there was nothing to do. No medicine, no food, no evacuation. We were sent to die, and we died. The British didn't defeat us, our own commanders did." Tanaka's words capture the operation's General William Slim's 14th Army suffered 17,587 casualties at Imphal Kohima. But the outcome for these casualties was dramatically different. Of the 4,064 killed in action, most died instantly from artillery, small arms fire, or accidents. They didn't suffer weeks of slow death from preventable disease. Of the 1,206 who died from disease, most contracted infections despite preventive medicine, malaria strains resistant to prophylaxis, unusual tropical diseases, complications from wounds. The death rate from disease was 7% of total casualties. The remaining 12,317 wounded or sick soldiers were evacuated to hospitals, treated, and most eventually recovered. The evacuation process was efficient. Forward aid stations stabilized patients, transport aircraft flew them to base hospitals in India within 24 hours, and full surgical facilities addressed complications. The survival rate for evacuated casualties exceeded 90%. Moreover, approximately 8,000 of these evacuated soldiers returned to duty within 6 months. Their units restored to combat effectiveness. The British Indian Army regenerated itself continuously. The logistics mathematics created a cycle of sustainability. Healthy soldiers fight effectively. Effective soldiers capture objectives with fewer casualties. Wounded soldiers receive treatment and return. Sick soldiers get medicine and recover. The force maintains strength. Operations continue successfully. Compare this to Japan's death spiral. Sick soldiers receive no medicine. They weaken and die. Units lose strength. Weakened units fail to capture objectives. Failures create more casualties. More casualties without treatment mean more deaths. The force collapses. Operations fail catastrophically. 2 systems, 2 outcomes. The difference was industrial logistics backed by medical infrastructure. Operation Yugo was the worst single disaster, but disease casualties plagued Japanese forces throughout the Burma campaign. Total Japanese casualties in Burma, 1945. Approximately 185,000 soldiers. Killed in action, approximately 25,000. Died from disease, starvation, and medical neglect, approximately 140,000, captured or missing, approximately 20,000. The ratio remained consistent across 3 years. Nearly 6 disease deaths for every combat death. Japan's army in Burma didn't fight a war, it committed slow-motion suicide. Meanwhile, total Allied casualties in Burma, approximately 70,000 with roughly 15,000 deaths, with 20% mortality rate versus Japan's 75%. The disparity reveals the campaign's hidden reality. This wasn't primarily combat. It was a logistical competition, where one side brought functional supply chains and the other brought warrior spirit. Supply chains won. The Burma campaign offers a lesson that echoes through military history into the present. Modern military study Operation Hugo in logistics courses, medical schools, and staff colleges. The lessons are painfully clear. First, warrior culture cannot substitute for supply infrastructure. Individual courage and unit cohesion matter, but they cannot overcome systemic logistical failure. Second, disease casualties can exceed combat casualties by an order of magnitude if preventive medicine is neglected. Every dollar spent on medical supplies saves $5 in replacement costs. Third, aerial supply can transform operational possibilities. Forces that can be supplied by air can operate in terrain that would starve ground-supplied forces. Fourth, realistic planning must account for worst-case logistical scenarios. Hope is not a logistics strategy. These lessons applied in Vietnam, where American forces maintained elaborate medical infrastructure that kept disease casualties minimal. They applied in Iraq and Afghanistan, where aerial supply and forward surgical teams saved thousands of lives. And they will apply in future conflicts, because the fundamental mathematics haven't changed. Human bodies still require calories, water, and vitamins. Wounded soldiers still need surgery. Sick soldiers still need medicine. Tropical environments still breed diseases. Supply chains still determine operational sustainability. The technology improves. Helicopters replace C-47s. Antibiotics become more powerful. Satellite communications enable precise logistics tracking. But the underlying truth remains constant. The assembly line is more powerful than the front line. The supply chain is the combat multiplier. Logistics isn't everything in war, but without logistics, everything else is nothing. Imagine the Chinwin River today. The jungles have reclaimed the trails. The road of bones has vanished under vegetation. No monuments mark where 53,000 soldiers marched to their deaths. The battles are forgotten except by specialists and survivors' families. But walk through that jungle with a historian, and they'll point out depressions where trails once ran, rusted metal fragments from abandoned equipment, the occasional skeletal remains still emerging from the soil after 79 years. The bones tell a story that generals wanted buried, a story of hubris meeting biology, a story where mathematics defeated mythology, a story proving that in modern warfare, the most important battle happens not on the front lines, but in the factories, the supply depots, the field hospitals, and the logisticians' spreadsheets. Mutaguchi sent 53,000 men to fight the British Empire, but the British didn't destroy his army, he destroyed it himself, through willful ignorance of logistical reality. If you found this deep dive into disease warfare compelling, consider subscribing to this channel. We explore the hidden mathematics of military history, the unglamorous stories where spreadsheets defeated soldiers, where factories determined outcomes, where logistics changed everything. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And have you heard of Operation Hugo before, or is this a new piece of World War II history for you? The Burma campaign proves that wars are won not just by warriors but by the systems that sustain them, and that truth deserves to be remembered.